only mode.
Okay, hi, my name is Deirdre Mason and I'm with the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, and I'll be the host today for the Creative Partnerships webinar that is the first in a series of webinars for the Source Water Collaborative's New Learning Exchange. I want to thank you all for joining us. We have almost 100 people registered from various organizations and backgrounds. And the collaborative is a group of 26 associations and organizations that work together as well as individually with their constituents to help policymakers, planners, agricultural interests, developers, citizens groups, and others integrate source water protection into key decisions, especially decisions concerning land use. I've highlighted AWWA, AWWA, Clean Water Action, and the U.S. Forest Service here because we're all on the webinar today. So the Source Water Collaborative has launched this new learning exchange in celebration of our 10-year anniversary, and the learning exchange aims to strengthen the effectiveness of source water practitioners across the country by providing a platform to share experiences, transfer knowledge, and learn about funding and technical resources available to support their efforts. Over the next 5 months, from now through December 2016, the Learning Exchange will offer organized events, communications, and resources by theme. Here you can see the different topic themes for each month that you have to look forward to. And for today's webinar theme on creative partnerships, our presenters will discuss their experiences with non-traditional partners and share tips on how to select potential partners and establish new partnerships, common barriers encountered and ways to overcome them, and sustaining and expanding partnerships for long-term engagement. For our first presentation today, Lynn Thorp from Clean Water Action and Steve Vaya from American Waterworks Association are going to share how they partnered with the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies and Rural Community Assistance Partnership to make sure EPA's final effluent limitation guidelines and standards do not leave water systems to grapple with bromide when a Clean Water Act program could help them avoid CIDWA compliance problems caused by upstream pollution discharges. For the second presentation on today's webinar, we'll hear from Jim Capurso with the U.S. Forest Service, who will share tips from the Drinking Water Providers Partnership, which is an effort that facilitates environmental conservation and restoration in municipal watersheds across the Pacific Northwest and includes multiple partners from federal and state agencies and NGOs. So before we start, I have a few maintenance items to go over. First, please type your questions into the questions box on the webinar control panel, as we will not be taking verbal questions. And you may type your questions at any time, but we will answer them after the presenters are all finished. We will also be posting a recording of the webinar on the Source Water Collaborative Learning Exchange webpage within the next week for those who missed it or would like to go back and watch it again. And this is a screenshot of the new Learning Exchange webpage where you can see the first month's theme of creative partnerships and find a variety of resources and photos from collaborative member organizations, as well as sample tweets for sharing information through social media, and a document with tips for collaborating with non-traditional partners. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lynn and Steve.
Hi everyone, this is Lynn Thorp. I'm the National Campaigns Director for Clean Water Action. I'm based in Washington, D.C. And we can go to our first slide. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about who we are. To put it in perspective, an organization founded in 1972, and we were actually founded in as the Clean Water Act was first passed, with the idea that it would take people and organizations to push this big new landmark law to reach its goals. And of course, that was true then and remains true now. Over the years, we've taken on a whole wide array of environmental and public health issues across many other pieces of the puzzle, clean energy, global warming, chemical policy, and things like that. But our national campaigns that we work on in Washington, D.C. and with our states, offices in about 15 states, do increasingly have a thread of drinking water protection, Safe Drinking Water Act implementation, and solving drinking water challenges running through them. So that's a little bit about who we are. Steve?
So I'm Steve Vyam with the American Water Works Association and Director of Federal Relations. The American Water Works Association is an international nonprofit. We're a scientific and education society, and we're really dedicated to providing solutions to assure that water is effectively managed in all aspects. But we do have a long history, in particular, in drinking water. The association was founded back in 1881, and so we've, as an association, been at it for quite some time. At this point, we are a pretty large group with about 50,000 professional members, around 4,000 utility members, and those utility members make up on order of 80% of the nation's drinking water supply, and they treat almost half of the nation's wastewater. So what we try and do is bring that expertise to bear, both in developing technical and educational material for the sector, but also try to provide that information to that resource to the policy environment as well at both the state and federal level. I think we're ready for the next slide. So in developing this presentation, I thought it would be important to focus on the basics. And the first one is, in developing a partnership and knowing that the partners have a common interest and shared needs. And in this instance, both Clean Water Action and AWWA recognized that there was a clear link between a point source and downstream water supplies, and that the effluent from those point sources could have a substantial effect on the downstream water treatment plants. There were instances where bromide releases from power plants had resulted in frank excursions of MCLs, and that's not counting situations where there's just an effect but not yet a violation. We also knew from the fact that we were looking at a rulemaking that there was clear regulatory authority, that we weren't going to need to debate, that there was an opportunity for intervention, and we could look at the available information and come to pretty clear agreement right from the start that there were available solutions for the problem at hand. And then while we had agreement on those common interests, we also shared some strengths and some weaknesses on either side that we could help partner with in filling needs. So while AWWA had good expertise on drinking water, Clean Water Action had already been doing a lot of legwork in terms of the base issue of what was going on inside of this rulemaking, and getting an appreciation of where the power plants were, and helped educate us, as well as we could bring the information we knew about the impacts on drinking water. And between us, we had an ability to do a better job documenting the data that you need to have in order to inform federal policy. And probably the strongest point is that together we built political capital, both with decision makers and more broadly in terms of the topic, knowing that more than just the downstream water utilities were interested in the topic, but there were folks interested in protecting the waters generally helped get more attention than we would have gotten individually. Lynn?
Mm-hmm. You know, we didn't just dive into working together collaboratively from nowhere. I think the kind of effort we did on this campaign to directly work on a Clean Water Act initiative wouldn't have gone as well if we did just pick up the phone and call each other out of the blue and decide to take a risk and work together. You know, Clean Water Action, of course, has a long history working. Oh, and we can go to the next slide. Clean Water has a long history working on, of course, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and of course AWWA and AMWA and RCAP have worked so much on every aspect of the Safe Drinking Water Act and drinking water issues and drinking water system issues. And so what happened, I think, over a number of years was that we found ourselves working together a lot in meetings, in official processes like federal advisory committees, with EPA and others on so many issues. You can see some of them up here on the screen. And as we talked about things like emerging contaminants or the total coliform rule or source water protection, we recognized there was a lot of common ground, and that a common interest was this idea that we continue to leave threats to source water, potential contamination on the table, if it were, where there are pollution sources that, for a variety of reasons, our other laws are not controlling, other actors are not made to control these pollution sources, and they put a burden on systems and on public health and on the consumers who pay their water bills. And we began to talk, I think about 5 years ago or so, about more proactively and intentionally building on that common interest where we thought we could make a difference. And so we were prepared when this Power Plant Clean Water Act rulemaking came along, and this was looking at it turns out, the largest toxic discharger to water in the United States, working off Clean Water Act guidelines that were about 30 years old. And so we knew we had a real opportunity, but we probably wouldn't have seen it the same way or been able to do what we did if we hadn't been working on creating the room and the space to work together. Also, we'd spent those years, along with people at EPA and elsewhere, talking about the need to integrate these two landmark water laws. So we were prepared in our minds and organizationally for saying there really needs to be a closer look at drinking water impacts when we're doing Clean Water Act initiatives like this one. So I think and as noted, as you can see on the slide, that those years of building trust and of learning more about each organization's objectives, as well as some of the barriers, recognizing that we wouldn't agree on everything all the time and that should not stop us from working together where we can. Those take time and intentionality, I think. And we really recommend that as an approach rather than waiting till you need someone and just expecting them to dive in and join you in your effort. So I think we can go to the next slide.
So while Lynn's made a great point that we've been working for a long time to get to know each other, and we built some bridges, and we had some commonalities of interest in the general area of the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act nexus. It was key to have a real concrete activity that we could work together on. So we have, in this instance, a federal rulemaking process. So it gave us a real discrete task that we could work toward. And so, again, just repeating the point that we made earlier of the sum here of our resources was greater than our individual efforts. Some ways that came to play out in the federal rulemaking process was not only in the data collection and the development of cogent arguments, but it also meant that when we went to brief folks at EPA, we could get a meeting with somebody farther up the chain, or if we went into Council on the Environment or Office of Management and Budget, they paid more attention to what we had to say because we had two groups that didn't normally, that they weren't used to seeing in the same room together on the same message. And so that synergy really did play through as a very, very powerful tool because we were in a discrete process where the partnership wasn't typical. It didn't fit everybody's expectations walking in, and we were able to leverage that to good effect.
Yeah.
Lynn?
Yeah. Yeah, and so how we did it, and Steve has alluded to, you can go to the next slide. We needed to do a few things here. I mean, one was to make sure that we were on the same page in terms of our goals. And in this case, we were able to say, we know that there's an important Clean Water Act rulemaking coming up where a piece of the puzzle, the bromide pollution from power plants, may not get handled in the same way as other pollutants. Because as you all know, many of you know, we're still learning about that one. The Clean Water Act isn't all set up for that one. But we also know that it's important, and we're going to need this addressed in the future. We knew also that bromide pollution could increase as coal plants installed air pollution control equipment, a very important thing as well to protect public health. And so we also know that EPA for well over a decade has been working on integrating Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act. So the pieces were there, but we knew that we needed to work together to see if we could elevate the issue and get this rule to take a bigger step on bromide than we thought it would do. Another thing we needed to do was to recognize that we had different strengths to bring to the table. We at Clean Water Action knew a lot about the daily intricacies of an EPA rulemaking on the Clean Water Act side. Our partners in the drinking water associations do more on the Safe Drinking Water Act side, so we could bring that understanding of what would be needed and what would happen when. And our partners in the drinking water associations had experience with this problem at the system, and also as it went along, new information and emerging research to share that we didn't have. And I think probably one of the most important parts was knowing, sort of what information and data the agency needed at what time, and what arguments about that data and about the problem would be most effective with the different players. So, for example, during the course of it, as Steve, I think, alluded to, we met it sometimes with, and my colleague Jennifer Peters, by the way, did a lot of this work with the associations. They met with technical staff in the Office of Water who have to do the day-to-day hard work of figuring this whole rulemaking out. And those people needed a certain kind of information and found certain arguments useful. Later, Jennifer knew which people to meet with in the administrator's office, so higher up in EPA, to alert them in a different, less detailed way to something very important going on. And I think probably in that meeting, being together and using the power of this diverse collaboration was one of the most important steps. They are not used to seeing environmental organizations and drinking water associations come into the administrator's office to talk about a Clean Water Act issue. That's very important. That got some, we'd like to think, got some attention and put some seriousness on the issue. And then, of course, when a rulemaking goes to interagency review over at the White House Office of Management and Budget, it's also very important and often overlooked that a meeting over there can be very helpful to move things along in case there are problems being encountered during interagency review. And so we also did those meetings. And again, that the power of two very different kinds of, or two different kinds of players, several organizations represented, I think was very important. So how we did it, I think, was putting together our strengths, taking that common vision, and being willing to take the risk of speaking together and all doing things we hadn't done before. And I guess it's important to note that we believe the final outcome moved the issue along. It didn't solve the whole problem because bromide is, as you know, a relatively new issue, but the final initiative contains a number of places, recognition of the bromide issue as being important, and puts in place some steps that state permitters and all of us can use to make progress on that issue in the future. And I think that's the end of our presentation.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Lynn and Steve. And we have just their contact information here if you would like to ask them more questions. As we mentioned, the webinar is being recorded, so you can find their contact information in the recording as well. And with that, we will turn over to James Capurso from the USDA Forest Service. James.
Hi, good morning to you on the West Coast, and good afternoon for you on the East Coast. This is Jim Capurso. I'm the Regional Fisheries Biologist for the USDA Forest Service. I'm responsible for the Fisheries Program in Oregon and Washington for the U.S. Forest Service. I'd first like to thank the previous speakers, Lynn in particular. I worked for Clean Water Action in the early 80s, and so it was really cool getting caught up through your slideshow. So that was really neat. Next slide, please. So what I want to do in this presentation is introduce you to a partnership, a new partnership that's formed in the Pacific Northwest called the Water Providers Partnership. And I'm going to do so by sharing with you the origin of the partnership, and then get into the first and second year of its development, right up through our first grant process that is just concluded, happened this year. And then I want to kind of go over maybe some lessons learned, and then I think the plan is to just open up for questions for both presentations. Next slide, please. All right, let's start up with some background. So both the U.S. Forest Service and NGO called GEOS Institute are cooperators in this Western Waters group called Carpe Diem West. Most of you have probably heard of this group. It's a nonprofit organization that's pretty diverse in as far as its participants, and it's developing innovative and sustainable responses to Western United States water crisis issues. Next slide, please. So both of these groups, the Forest Service and GEOS Institute, because they're involved with this group, they had some common understandings. I want to share with you some of these understandings. One is that 2/3 of the U.S. fresh water comes from forested watersheds. 50% of water used in the Western United States originates from National Forest Service lands. 68% of U.S. community water systems rely on surface water. And then in Oregon and Washington in particular, 65% of Oregonians and 40% of Washingtonians rely primarily on surface water for their drinking water sources. Next. Also, there's some common understanding that source water protection pays. For every 10% increase in forest cover, there's 20% decrease in water costs. And for every $1 spent in source water protection, there's $27 savings in water treatment costs. And so these were common understandings that we shared. Next slide, please. And so because of this, GEOS Institute looked across the table and thought and saw the Forest Service there and thought, it would be great if we could develop this type of relationship to restore municipal watersheds within the Pacific Northwest. And so we were approached, and individual by the name of Brian Barr from GEOS Institute approached me, and we kind of talked about it. What we wanted to explore was this sweet spot between clean, inexpensive drinking water and municipal watershed restoration. We wanted to identify, implement, and monitor watershed restoration within municipal watersheds to benefit watershed and fisheries resources. Next slide, please. So these next few slides are kind of my view of the world, maybe from the perspective of the USDA Forest Service. So as Brian come to me and talk with me about this opportunity, I saw it as a great opportunity. Here's why. It's obviously an opportunity to protect and restore drinking water for communities dependent upon healthy Forest Service watersheds. It's an opportunity to coordinate and cooperate with an organization that traditionally has been a litigant. GEOS Institute had sued the Forest Service on several occasions dealing with timber sales. That was very interesting to me in that when my some colleagues within my regional office heard this was going on, I heard some water cooler talk of how could you form a partnership with a group that's been a litigant with us in the past. And I knew at that point I really needed to because what my experience throughout my career is that when these type of opportunities present itself, you could find some of the most meaningful and fertile ground when it comes to developing partnerships and collaborating to achieve conservation missions. And so there's also an opportunity to broaden the base of support for watershed restoration in the Pacific Northwest. I'm sure that many on the phone, and I've seen several of the folks that are listed here in participating, you're involved with watershed restoration work. Generally, for the most part, it's the same players, the same usual suspects when it comes to restoration. What I was really looking for is something to broaden our portfolio, if you will, of income to get more restoration work done within the Pacific Northwest. And this looked like an opportunity for that. Lastly, it's an opportunity to further align with agency direction. Let me get into that in the next couple slides. Next slide, please. So let's start with the Organic Act for the U.S. Forest Service, 1897. Most of you recognize that's a photo of Gifford Pinchot. His vision for the Forest Service that was captured in our Organic Act was to secure favorable conditions of water flows and to furnish a continuous supply of timber from National Forest Service for the citizens of the United States. In my opinion, and I think many of my colleagues' opinions, we've done pretty well as far as the timber part goes. We've learned how to plant trees the right side up, and we've worked well with communities and really continue to support communities with timber resources. I think that, in my professional opinion, I think we've fallen short on the water responsibility. I think we need to move forward on that in several fronts. And our agency is doing so with more of an emphasis on the water part of that two-part mission in our Organic Act. Next slide, please. So both our secretary, and then next slide, and our chief emphasize the need for restoration in particularly cooperative restoration. And so the Water Providers Partnership really fit in with their mission, where they are trying to push the agency and the Department of Agriculture as a whole. Next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about the first year, and that was developing grassroots partnerships. Next slide, please. So GEOS Institute and Forest Service, Brian and I, decided to do a dog and pony show, and so we went to 15 municipal watersheds, 15 water providers for towns and cities in the Coast Range and in the Cascades of Oregon during that year. We visited with them. Some of these were one-horse towns. Some were larger cities, like Eugene and Medford. And it didn't matter where we were. There was always this support for what our proposal was, which was to find that sweet spot in municipal watersheds for restoration. One-horse towns, a lot of times we heard, this is so great, I want to be really involved with this. And but we don't have much money. However, we do have an excavator, we have an operator, we can turn these folks loose to do some work up in these watersheds under your supervision and your support for doing some of the corrections that need to happen. And then the larger town said, yeah, we want to get involved. But in all cases, it was like, if we could find some source of funding to do this work at the grassroots level, it would even be better. Next slide, please. All right, so when we visited with these folks, we used fish migration barrier culverts as kind of like a surrogate that indicated that there was needs within those municipal watersheds, because it indicated both a chronic issue with sedimentation and potential catastrophic potential issue that could happen in the future. An example is that culvert, that perch culvert that's undersized that you see in the picture on the right. There you can see the erosion that continues to happen downstream as that high flow events and even the lower flow events erode the water downstream. But also you see that road fill associated with that. Eventually that's going to blow out. Either way, that gets delivered down to intakes of these water providers. They got it. Next slide, please. So we showed them a map that looks like this. At the same time, our region was putting together our fish migration barrier database that had these maps for throughout the region that shows all the migration culverts, barrier culverts. So we were able to show that project completed now. We were able to show this and really show them where the problem was within their municipal watershed when it comes to those issues. And also that indicated there was some management, land management that was happening in their watershed, so there might be some other things that we wanted to look at. The acceptance was universal. In most cases, we followed up that meeting with inviting more folks to the table. So we had a second meeting with the water providers, and we invited the local watershed restoration practitioners. And there they developed these relationships, grassroots level, where they identified all those other watershed restoration activities that could happen within the public water systems. Next slide, please. Let's get into the second year. Next slide, please. All right, so the second year we are looking at developing this portfolio of funding in which at the regional level we could start funding these projects. And basically there were other agencies and organizations that just jumped at the opportunity because they saw that working collaboratively they could get more done, and this was basically part of their mission. So the other partners that joined us the second year included Washington Department of Health, Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, Bureau of Land Management, that's the national agency, EPA, and Wild Earth Guardians, which is an NGO that's based out of Portland but is involved with restoration work and forest protection issues in the Pacific Northwest. Next slide, please. All right, so we developed these goals, and they're listed here. We want to restore and protect the health of watersheds, which communities depend upon for drinking water, while also benefiting aquatic and riparian ecosystems, including native fish. We also wanted to support local partnerships between downstream drinking water providers and upstream landowners and restoration practitioners. Next slide, please. So basically anyone could, so we put a pot of funding together and anyone could apply for it to get that type of restoration work done in municipal watersheds. You can see a list of potential applicants in the first bullet. Second bullet points out that for the state money, was the second bullet points out that the state money was available only for the public water systems, and those dollars could go towards any of the activities that I'll mention in the following slide. Next slide, please. I'm wondering if you skipped a slide there. Can you go back one? Yeah, okay. No, forward 2 slides. There you go. Thanks. Just my screen's flickered there a little bit. It seems to continue to flicker. All right, so the next one, eligibility. You can see here in this map some the areas where national forest land occurs, where BLM land occurs, and some of the priority areas of both of our agencies. We had a ranking system to award dollars to applicants in Oregon and Washington. And to get maximum points, the project should be in priority areas for U.S. Forest Service or BLM. And in Oregon, it should be in sensitive area that's identified by DEQ. And updated source water assessment delineation plans. Next slide, please. So the project types, they include planning, design, outreach, education, monitoring. The work should address water quality or quantity issues with the public drinking water system and should benefit native fish and their habitat. And the proposed work should be identified in existing plans. Those plans could be things like our Forest Service restoration action plans, should be in species recovery plans, could be in some type of publicly vetted prioritization document. What was really important to us was where the source water protection plans existed within the states. Next slide, please. So I think that this slideshow will be saved, so you'll have an opportunity to take a look at the type of projects that that are eligible. I list them here on this slide. You don't have to read through the thing now. I did want to point out, though, that the partners all sat around the table saying, "Oh, what type of projects are we going to fund?" And Oregon Department of Environmental Quality had this list that they already established, and we looked at it, and this is basically the list. We looked at it and we said, well, this is perfect. This fits all of our needs. I think there were a couple that we deleted where the federal agencies couldn't legally fund, but other than that, the list is pretty much what DEQ put together and Washington Department of Health uses also. Next slide, please. All right, so the first year in which we entertained grant applications and awarded them last January, we put together $660,000 through our interagency, interorganizational partnerships. We received 20 funding applications. We funded 11 of those 20. They were all in Oregon, which is too bad, and we've been working on that as far as getting more Washington involvement. Also, Geos Institute received a grant from Meyer Memorial Trust for monitoring some of those projects. Next slide, please. these are the projects, the type of projects that were funded in 2016, the things that are being implemented as we speak. Next slide, please. So here's some lessons learned. I'll just kind of go over some of these things. So when you get these groups together, I mean, let's just focus in on the state and federal relationship. Our fiscal years are different, and so we need to account for the different timing and the different limitations that the agencies have. Certainly, the state of Washington doesn't want to fund anything with their state money in Oregon, and Oregon doesn't want to fund anything up in Washington. So we need to be cognizant of that and be careful of where the funds get appropriated. Another thing is we found that the widen authority that BLM and Forest Service has was extremely valuable. Widen authority gives BLM and Forest Service the opportunity to work with their partners off their federal lands for restoration work, as long as that restoration work benefits agency resources, for instance, and we can make that case when it comes to fish that migrate downstream through downstream lands to get onto National Forest Service system to spawn. And so those restoration projects that we perform downstream of Forest Service land can benefit those fish. So through the Widen Authority, we have the opportunity to spend federal resources in those areas. And then, as I mentioned, there was an insufficient pool of projects within the state of Washington this first go around, and so we really need to work on that, and we have. But we've been doing lots of marketing up in Washington, and I think we'll get more applications this upcoming year. Next slide. And so I wanted to recognize my close partners in this. Definitely this is something that is just an extraordinary partnership and opportunity for me to work with these extraordinary conservationists. And so I've listed them here. The names here are the folks that are representing their agencies and organizations. And then you're welcome to contact folks if you have more questions. That's my last slide.
Great. Thank you so much, Jim. And let me just remind everybody that the webinar is being recorded, and we will have it available on the Source Water Collaborative Learning Exchange webpage after the webinar within the next week. So you can look there if you want to go back and review it or share it with other people that weren't able to participate today. If you haven't had a chance to yet, please type your questions into the questions box, and we'll go ahead and start going through those. So I'm going to start from the beginning with a couple questions that were directed towards Lynn and Steve, and I'm going to sort of frame these in terms of the purpose of our webinar. So there are a couple questions from the same person that asks any thoughts on how stormwater runoff fits into the picture, or any thoughts on the management of impervious surfaces, to promote stormwater infiltration. So maybe Steve and Lynn, if you could think about that in terms of the partnership that you formed to address the effluent limitation guide. If there's any suggestions for also doing some work or partnering to address some stormwater issues as well.
I guess one thing that comes immediately to mind is that both of our organizations are positive on green infrastructure as a solution for stormwater. Lynn, am I on target there?
Yeah, I think that's right. We haven't yet worked together on those at the federal level on stormwater issues, but Sure, I think it's one of the many examples of things where drinking water can benefit from something that isn't a Safe Drinking Water Act issue, and we might consider delving into it, or that could happen with people in our organizations in a place.
Another one that would kind of fit in that ballpark is agricultural non-point. We've both had an interest in that, and again, it comes down to finding that opportunity where either at a local level with the utility or here at the federal level where there's a chance to do something together.
Okay, great. Well, that also answered the next question, which was about non-point source discharges, or about non-point sources. So thank you. And then I think that the next question is directed to Jim, and the person asked, are there any thoughts on the benefits of riparian forest buffers for source water protection? Again, I think we want to sort of frame these answers in the context of partnerships and your work that you've done there with the Drinking Water Providers Partnership.
Yeah, certainly. That fits into our project mix and things that we would identify.
Maybe, was there anything in particular that you could expand on that, just in terms of things you've done for buffers, using buffers, or some of the projects you've done, or priorities, in terms of priorities?
Yeah, certainly. There's one project that we funded this year in which there's a weed-ridden riparian area where weed treatment occurred, and then riparian planting occurred to improve the quality of that riparian area, so it would better serve as a filter to upland pollution sediment sources.
Okay, great. And then there's a question, well, it's not really a question, it's kind of a comment on, balancing the goals of both different types of organizations where some are focused on water and some are focused on forestry and timber. And so, Jim, do you have any thoughts to share on sort of how you balance both of the organizations' goals related to water versus timber?
I guess I'd answer that question. I think the individual is probably, the timber part, the individual is probably referring to either the Forest Service or the BLM. And I would counter that and say that clean water is very much a part of the mission of the Forest Service and BLM, and healthy habitat for wildlife and fish associated with riparian and aquatic habitats. So I don't think there was much of a balance that had to happen there. Certainly, I'm a fisheries biologist, and it was very easy for me to work with the other folks that were listed in the last slide of my presentation, because we had a common mission and a common understanding of the needs to move forward from the very start. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. And then the next question for you, Jim, is are there any recommended watershed models to help target source water protection priorities? I know you mentioned that you used some of the priorities from the Oregon source water assessments, and also you worked with Washington State, so maybe you could just expand a little bit there on your priority setting.
I'm really glad that someone asked that question. Let me focus in on the Forest Service. We have the Watershed Condition Framework, which identifies our priority watersheds now throughout the nation. Certainly several years prior to its establishment, the Pacific Northwest region had something similar. And so we have identified the watersheds within the region that are high priority for us to restore. And then in BLM, over the last couple of years, they've also developed priority areas. The state water quality agencies have also identified priority areas to focus in on, both at the state and the federal level. Those priority areas put an emphasis on the completion of, in our case, watershed restoration action plans, which list things that need to happen to move the rating of that watershed from improve its condition. And so we, in most cases, we have this ready to go list, and it's just a matter of getting the financial resources to move forward to treat those areas. And that's how the watershed, that's how the Drinking Water Providers Partnership has helped out. As we expect it'll continue to grow, and we continue to look for other partners that can help invest in it so that we can get more work done quicker within these priority areas.
Great, thank you. I have a couple questions about funding that are also for you, Jim. Maybe if you could expand on the specific sources of funding that you pulled together, and then also, you know, how you worked with partners to get the funding pulled together, sort of how you were able to set that up, and also, you know, whether you had meetings or conference calls, sort of the process of it as well.
Yeah, how much time we have for this question? Yeah, let's start with the meeting part of it. It's a fun group. I actually like working with this group tremendously, and so whenever we can, we meet live. But obviously, when you have such a diverse group, it's hard to get on the same calendar. I would say that the majority, if not all of our meetings, have been live. I remember a couple times we met in the local restaurants here in Portland, which was fun to kind of kick out ideas as we were first starting. But then when we really rolled up our sleeves, it was really important for us to meet face to face. Sometimes there was travel restrictions where a couple folks had to call in because they couldn't leave their state or something. But we, for most part, we were face to face, and that seemed to work out well. And so, yeah, we did meet, but it wasn't, you know, it'd be like for a half day here and there, and we might have had, I don't know, I'm thinking like maybe 4 half-day meetings, something like that, to get the whole project kind of defined when it comes to goals and criteria for selection, and then going through applications and rating applications right to the award part. Now it's pretty much maintenance where we communicate by email, and we meet face to face. I expect this winter we'll probably meet a couple times face to face as we get the new round of applications. But most of it is electronic communication now. So that works pretty well. Funding, the funding sources were all the agencies. The NGOs, Geos Institute and Wild Earth Guardians have been instrumental in, they continue to apply for grants to get additional external private funding towards us. So it's really great having them involved. And as I mentioned before, Geos Institute did receive a foundation grant from Meyer Memorial Grant or foundation to fund monitoring. Let's see, what else? The money, where it came from, it really depends on the agency that you're talking about. In most cases, I'd say in all cases, it was either water quality dollars or fish and wildlife dollars that went towards projects. In the Forest Service case, the exception is we did have some legacy roads and trails dollars that we could dedicate towards some of the road decommissioning, road related type of work that that was approved for work. Does that cover it? Do you want to follow up with any questions that you that I didn't cover there?
The only thing extra I think would be maybe to just expand on the point of whether there were any differences of opinion in your sort of mission and funding equity.
Differences in opinion in our mission. Now, I think we pretty much, as I recall, we pretty much landed on the same mission, and we all felt really comfortable with that mission. So I don't think there was an issue there. Funding equity, I don't think any of us saw the world that way. In other words, hey, I'm putting in $200,000 and you're only putting in $1,000. What's up with you type thing? No, I think we all, as administrators of agencies and program managers, we are cognizant that we can only do what we can do. And so I don't think there was ever any talk, or even I'd say whether that even entered anyone's mind. You know, everybody has a role to play, and they're in it because they want to make a difference. So I don't think that had application here.
Okay, thank you. And then this question is also for you, Jim. It's a little bit different, and that is, could you expand or talk a little bit more about your monitoring efforts and whether you're able to measure water quality improvements?
That question's a little premature. Kathy Kellen, who's now serving for GEOS Institute, is developing a strategy, and she's working with USGS to get that done. So it's in the developmental phase.
Okay, great. And then I'm just trying to scroll through some of the questions here. Jim, also for did you approach the Department of Transportation as a potential funding source, or did you work with the Department of Transportation at all?
You know, it sounds like a great idea. We're developing a list of places where we'll be canvassing, and I'll add that one to the list.
All right. We have a couple more questions, but I think they might take a while to answer. One was, you know, what steps would be helpful to take in getting a partnership like yours started and continued moving forward. And then, so I don't know if there's anything quick you might be able to add. We just have a couple minutes left.
Yeah, I can answer that really quickly. For any of the questions, if your question didn't get answered, feel free to email me, and I'll take care of it by email. For that one, I'd say, based on my experience forming these type of partnerships throughout my 30-year career as a professional fish bio for the Forest Service, I'd say the #1 thing is to drop the turfism. It's really important that you step back and realize that there's other agencies and organizations that are out there that are after the same goals you are, and it's time to roll up your sleeves and get that type of work done where you have overlapping missions and goals.
All right, great. Well, I think that takes care of most of our questions, and we're just a little bit past the hour mark. So I want to say thank you to all of our presenters. Very, very helpful, useful information. Again, we're going to have a recording of the webinar on the Learning Exchange website. So thanks to all of the presenters and for all of you joining us today. And with that, we'll conclude the webinar.